Hello, I'm Sven Herrmann, the Director of Consulting and Seminars at CADFEM Medical. Today I'm giving a presentation about simulation, also referred to as in silico methods, and its application in the approval process of medical devices. Before I start, I would like to give you a short overview of our company and what we are doing. We are a small and highly specialized startup within the CADFEM group, which brings already 40 years of experience in the field of finite element simulation. Our team, as you see, currently consists of 11 professionals with background in engineering and software development. We also have an advisory board with currently 5 scientific and business experts on it. So our vision is to enhance the well-being of patients with simulation. Out of that, our mission is to transfer simulation technologies to medical device manufacturers and medical professionals alike, along with our partners. We are a 13485 certified company, and we are developing software as a medical device according to MDR requirements using ANSYS simulation technologies. Our main focus is the development of our software tools and platform DocQ to use simulation in medicine and medical technology. We have developed and are developing several clinical apps together with partners to, for example, perform surgical planning, virtual fitting, or support diagnosis or treatment of patients. Also, we provide consulting services to teach and use simulation in the device approval process or to perform patient-specific simulations. For example, to support ex vivo tests, virtual benchtops, post-market surveillance, and so on. Science and research is a very important part of our enterprise because we are working very closely linked with our research partners to establish a profound scientific basis for all our services and products, and to develop new ideas and to test their applicability and accuracy together with clinicians, surgeons, hospitals, companies, and universities. So in the presentation, I want to give you a short overview of what in silico is, what initiatives, regulations, standards, and guidelines are already in place, and finally, some insights into where simulation can be applied in the approval process, along with some examples of our daily practice. So when we are looking into this journey of a medical device, from its first idea to a manufactured prototype until the submission for approval, there are several steps involved to ensure and document product verification and validation. When using conventional methods, this usually results into a 3 to 7 years process on average, which costs up to $50 million and where 85% of the cases fail. Also, there's only a 50% chance of receiving actual approval after submission. The conventional methods used for product verification and validation usually are bench testing, animal studies, and clinical trials. These three have traditionally been the main sources of evidence for the American Food and Drug Administration, also known as FDA, to get medical devices on the US market. However, the FDA recognized very early that computational modeling has a great potential for the healthcare industry and has defined a significant role for modeling and simulation in its strategic priorities. They saw the opportunities to save costs, get a deeper understanding of models and experiments, augment clinical trials with synthetic patients, and the most important, reduce the number of animals and humans in vivo experiments. The FDA already states today, as you can see here, that scientific evidence for medical device regulation decision-making comes from 4 different types and not only 3 of models, which is a logical step that other industries like automotive and aerospace already took. So they are supporting the implementation of computational modeling and simulation in the regulatory process with guidelines, standards, and initiatives for in silico clinical trials. For the healthcare industry, that means going from in vitro to in vivo for animal and human trials to in silico. In Europe, we are slowly starting to wake up. The European Commission recognized the benefits of computational modeling and simulation in its new European Union health proposals. That is truly a very positive sign, but we still have a lot to catch up on. The term in silico is an expression meaning performed on a computer or via computer simulation, and is a reference to biological or medical device experiments or studies. So while in vivo refers to studies performed in living organisms and in vitro to studies outside of a living organisms in labs or benchtop testing, in silico means performed in or on a computer. There are several applications of in silico, as you can see here, but usually we separate it into 4 different areas. So one would be, for example, virtual patients. The other one would be clinical apps. The third, actual development and testing of medical devices. And finally, everything related to biopharma. To wrap it up, there are several possibilities, benefits, and areas of application for simulation technologies. That is the reason why simulation becomes not only an important piece of evidence in the approval process today, but could also entirely replace in vitro and in vivo tests in the future, as seen here in the prognosis of the FDA and the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. So let's have a closer look on the current initiatives, standards, and guidelines with focus on the US and Europe. The medical device industry is a highly regulated industry, so nothing works without regulations and authorities which think the same way. In this sense, the FDA has identified an important role for computational modeling and simulation in its strategic priorities, as we can see here in the strategic roadmap on the right side of the slide. Within the FDA, there are overall 200 agents working on computational modeling and simulation-related issues. There's an increased emphasis by the FDA on simulation to support the device safety and efficiency. They support the implementation of computer modeling and simulation in the regulatory process. And most importantly, they develop guidance how to use and how to establish the credibility of simulation in regulatory decision-making. The FDA also sees several opportunities for simulation for medical devices, as you can see here on this slide. From simulation, the medical device itself, to simulation, the anatomy of a patient, over to simulation of chemical processes, simulation embedded in a device to predict processes and reactions of a patient, up to simulation of clinical trials themselves, meaning augmenting and performing some of the clinical trials on a computer with virtual patients. The FDA facilitates the adoption of in silico clinical trials for medical device and pharma applications with standards and guidelines. So on the left side, you see the 1807 guidance, which deals with how to report simulation for decision-making to the FDA. In detail, this means how to structure the reporting for digital evidence using simulation when you submit these to the FDA administration. In the middle, you can see the ASME VNV 40. This document teaches you how much verification and validation of your computer models have to be performed and how to assess the model credibility based on the influence and risk of a computer model. This document guides you through a so-called risk-informed credibility assessment framework to support your computer models with the necessary and sufficient verification and validation. For the sake of completeness, you see on the right side the FDA guidance for software as a medical device. In silico clinical apps that we develop at CADFEM Medical can be clinically evaluated after this guidance. The equivalent EU document would be the MedDev 2.16. One important issue when using computational models in the approval process is to assure model credibility in your documentation. The term model credibility refers to the trust in the predictive capability of the computational model for its context of use. So according to the ASME WinV40, which you saw on the previous slide, the model credibility should be assessed within a risk-informed framework, which you can see here on this slide. This framework starts by first defining the question of interest, which is the specific question that is being addressed. Based on this question, you establish the risk-informed credibility within 3 steps. The first step, you define the context of use to clarify the specific role and scope of the model used to address the question of interest. In the second step, you assess the model risk, which deals with the possibility that the simulation results may lead to an incorrect decision, which in return would lead to an adverse outcome. So in practice, this is done by evaluating the model influence on the decision, which is then plotted against the potential consequences from an adverse outcome. After that, you establish credibility goals for each credibility factor. These factors and goals basically represent the steps in the verification and validation process of your model. After this assessment, you begin with the actual verification and validation activities. It is important to know that you first establish and review the verification and validation strategy before executing it. This means that you define appropriate activities to meet each credibility goal, define criteria that demonstrate that each goal has been met, and finally review the activity plan to evaluate if overall credibility is sufficient. Finally, after the execution of your V&V plan of the model, the actual model credibility is checked. In case that the model is regarded not to be credible for the context of use, the whole process would be iterated again by, for example, redefining the context of use. The ASME provides a whole series of standards and guidelines on how to actually set up and carry out a verification and validation plan once you identified all required steps using the ASME V&V40. In these documents, it is explained in detail what verification and validation actually means in the context of computational models. They also clarify how a verification and validation plan looks like and what the important steps are to reach model validation as seen on the flowchart here. In a nutshell, you can say that model verification addresses the question whether I'm building the model right, whereas model validation, where you actually compare simulation results with real experimental data, addresses the question, am I building the right model? As mentioned before, Europe is lacking the US FDA in accepting simulation in the approval process. Therefore, a very important group has emerged as a request from the European Commission in 2016, the so-called Avicenna Alliance, which is a global organization that brings together healthcare stakeholders from industry and academia. The main mission of this alliance is to address regulatory barriers and develop policies on in silico medicine with a goal to make it a standard practice in healthcare. They're working closely with the FDA and European notified bodies to foster and adopt those in silico clinical trials. Here you see some examples of ongoing activities in the Avicenna Alliance, which are the good simulation practice for in silico clinical trials, the GSP, which is like the GLP and GCP in healthcare. It aims at establishing a standard for simulation and in silico clinical trials, but also for the design, execution, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analysis, and reporting of these in silico studies. Another example is a new task force dealing with notified bodies, which aims at educating notified bodies such that they are able to apply these new technologies in their daily practice. Here you see a first position paper of the Avicenna Alliance. This document describes the benefits of in silico methods, also defines essential terms and outlines a risk-based framework for establishing that a model has sufficient credibility for decision making. One goal with this position paper is to achieve harmonized guidance for the acceptance of in silico evidence by global regulatory authorities, as you can see here in their statement of this document. This was a short overview of the current initiatives, standards, and guidelines. Now I would like to show you how and where simulation can support the approval process or just simplify certain procedures along with some examples from our practice. When you compare computer methods with the other three conventional methods as mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, you can see that computational models come along with a lot of advantages when representing certain aspects of device performance. That is why computer models mostly outmatch the conventional methods in aspects such as representing diseased states, adapt for patient-specific properties, vary parameters, or just in saving time and costs. I will discuss now 3 cases where these advantages can be exploited with respect to the approval process. The first one is way ahead of the actual submission when a medical product is being developed from its first concept to the first results on its performance. By using conventional methods, there will be many design loops at this stage until the results from bench tests up to clinical trials show the results you want to achieve with this product. With simulation, however, the design loops to optimize the product performance can be carried out even before prototype manufacturing, which saves costs and effectively reduces the time to market. As an example, I would like to show you what we did for Ulrich Medical. In their development process, they're aware of the fact that any potential problem areas for their newly developed spinal systems could be identified too late when interacting with human body, which in return would result in complex corrections. So we simulated, amongst other things, the force for the used titanium screws with which they can be screwed in without any sign of failure. This kind of simulation effectively saved costs and time in an early stage of development for them. As a second case, I would like to highlight a few aspects when considering the general process from product concept until submission for approval. This process is usually tedious and expensive, which involves a lot of required experiments and measurements that are sometimes even difficult to obtain. This is especially the case when unique anatomy and physiology of every patient plays an important role. Simulation can facilitate and accelerate this process by, for example, including virtual tests for a large number of patients or conditions, by virtually planning your experiments and clinical trial design before and carry out model-based assessments of worst case scenarios. In this regard, I would like to give an example from one consulting project we conducted for KLS Martin. For patient-specific pre-prosthetic implants, which you can see on the right here, they faced the problem that every patient situation must be checked under biomechanical load conditions so that they can exclude complications and obtain proof of durability. We therefore determined the forces and loading of the implant when virtually implanted into the maxilla in a preoperative simulation. This simulation provided crucial insights for KLS into the functionality of their implants before the actual intervention and served as supplement of the technical files with objective results. As a last case, I would like to point out what happens when there is a request by a regulatory authority to the documents you submit for approval. When relying on conventional methods, any request leads to expensive iteration loops, as they may involve changes in the product design or a manufacturing process, which again have to be tested in more experiments. When using simulation, you can evaluate new solutions or carry out further analysis regarding, for instance, the root cause of failures with the same simulation protocol and use it as response to the request. After actual approval of your product, you can even utilize the simulation protocol for post-market surveillance purposes. I will show you 2 more examples how we solve difficult questions for our customers in the process of medical device approval and post-market surveillance. The first one was for Swiss Dental Solution, which you see here on the right. SDS was in the process of the 510K where they did physical tests of the worst cases of their dental implants and filled the results. They performed the physical test as usual and picked a worst case out of their product family. But the FDA stated that in this case, it is not secured that the other implant configurations could fail in this test. So basically, what they said was that the tested implants are not the worst cases or the worst case. So we had to provide evidence that the physically tested variants are those with the highest loading. SDS had 120 days to answer the request. They had only 2 implant types with 4 configurations, which would result in about 80 benchtop tests at a neutral lab, where one test takes approximately 72 hours. So you could easily imagine that that would have been also impossible to do within only 120 days. So we jumped in with simulation and provided evidence that the worst cases tested were really the worst cases. This provided rationally to drastically reduce the amount of physical tests, and SDS could positively answer the request in time, securing the product release in the US. On the left, you see one final example where we use simulation for Medartis in the context of post-market surveillance. They were facing increased requirements for follow-ups of their medical devices due to new laws and guidelines in Europe. So we analyzed and compared several implant systems within patient-specific simulations. These simulations objectively prove the performance and safety of the implants in the patients, which they could then use to support the results from their post-market clinical follow-ups. So that's basically it from my side. I hope I gave you some insights into simulation in the approval process of medical devices and how you also can apply it in this process. If you have any questions or feedback, you can contact me at any time or just send me an email. In this context, I also would like to point out our seminar we are offering to transfer our work and activities directly into the medical industry. In this seminar, you learn how to use and apply simulation in the product approval process. So if you're interested, you can easily register through our CADFEM Medical or the CADFEM website for the next seminar. Thank you very much for your attention and have a nice day.